Hello and welcome to this online course in international economics. My name is Emanuel Oliveira, PhD in economics, and I will be your instructor. Now, before I tell you more about myself, let me begin by justifying why I just showed you some images from this BBC program called Human Planet. My point was to illustrate the clear technological divide that we still currently live in. In the video, you saw people, for example, hunting animals by foot with rudimentary weaponry versus those with fast vehicles and advanced weapons. As such, those with better technologies are able to gather many more animals in the same period of time, and therefore the concentration of riches is not surprisingly accumulated more in developed nations than in the other nations that have yet to catch up in terms of technological progress. This pattern is nothing new. We have observed this throughout time. That nations with the better technologies were those that were dominating the world. For example, nowadays we refer to the United States as the world economic and military leader. This position was attained primarily in the post-World War I and more clearly after the World War II period. But prior to the United States, there was the United Kingdom, which gained leadership primarily fueled by the Industrial Revolution. The invention of, for example, the steam engine allowed them to produce much more with the same resources in a shorter period of time. So again, the emancipator of wealth being the availability of the latest technologies. Let's go a little bit further back. For example, when Portugal and Spain dominated the world. Why did they dominate the world? Again, because they had the best technology. They had boats that were able to travel around the world, survive storms with a capacity to bring a lot of merchandise, and nobody else did. So these allied with previous knowledge of knowing, how to navigate, meaning going anywhere and come back to the same place, gave the Portuguese initially, and then the Spanish in a shorter period of time later on, the world dominance, right? And in fact, this world dominance is blessed by Rome in 1494 with the Treaty of Tordesillas, which basically tells the Portuguese and the Spanish not to fight each other, given that they have the best technologies, and just to divide the world in two and explore as much as you can. So that's why, not surprising, in those days we have the African continent pretty much dominated by the Portuguese all the way to Japan, with stops in India and China. Brazil was kept by the Portuguese, but the rest of the Americas was given to the Spanish to explore. And the Spanish came all the way to the other side, to Philippines, right? That was the clear marcation of dividing the world in two. But what was the common sin of for example, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the British that made them lose this economic leadership? Well, they got accommodated. They stopped innovating. They were rich for such a long period, passing through from generation to the next generation, that they thought they would remain the world leaders forever. Not in their wildest dreams they were imagining to lose it. But this accommodation, this lack of a continued pursuit of technological innovation made other countries surpass them. Right. So, for example, when you have Portugal and Spain with the modernized fleet and conquering all these nations, the other countries were observing, right? And they were like, we want to do the same thing. We want to bring those riches to us as well. So France and England start adopting the technologies of the Portuguese and the Spanish and innovating on it. So We have France and England dominating the world, and that is translated on the occupation of the territory that today we know as the United States. What clearly the market England from France was the Industrial Revolution, right? And then it was passed on to the United States because, again, of the technological innovation being incubated here more than anywhere else. But we can go further back if we want to. We can go to the Roman Empire times. Rome used to dominate pretty much all of Europe. Why did they lose their dominance? The same reason. They got accommodated and stopped pursuing the continuous technological development. And in fact, the trigger of losing the power of Rome is that they were so accommodated and felt so superior to everybody else that they stopped paying their mercenaries as much as they should to keep their borders. So the Visigoths come down, claiming their money, and take over Rome. Right? And this is about the year 400s. Okay. So what ensues after is once this stability is broken by this dominant power, Europe begins the so-called period of the Dark Ages. And why am I mentioning the Dark Ages? Because it is a period characterized by the stagnation of knowledge. Okay? We were entertained with wars, and actually the books, the sources of knowledge, where knowledge was recorded, were being destroyed. One of the things that these barbarians did, the Visigoths, that's how we used to refer to them, as the barbarians, they were not very versed in literacy, right? So they decided to burn all the books that they could find. For example, the monasteries, they'll break it down, and the monasteries were where the main libraries were located at. Because remember, at this time, only the clergy and the nobles knew how to read. The peasants couldn't access that knowledge because they didn't know how to read. They were just learning by doing, not by reading. And this is perpetuated for many centuries, this state of affairs. Okay? What happens? Well, the world doesn't stop, right? So during this period, we have the rise of the Muslim world. Okay? The rise of the Muslim world. And this ended up translating into the Moors invading Europe, primarily the European Iberian Peninsula. And this was done in the 700s. And they stayed there pretty much up to the 1500s, being the last ones expelled in the 1600s. Okay? But by 1492, that's when Granada in the south of Spain falls. The Queen Isabella defeat them, and their influence was pretty much neglectable thereafter. But there's still a lot of monuments here from those days, particularly in the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula. The curious thing that happened, well, related with this technological progress, is that they had the best technology. Okay? While the Europeans were entertained with killing each other, they were entertained in gathering knowledge and conquering. Curious enough, the books like the ones written by Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, 2,000 years ago in Greece, are coming back to Europe thanks to the translations of Arabic translations of those Greek books. Remember that the Visigoths, the barbarians, they destroyed the libraries, so those books started to come back to Europe thanks of being translated from Arabic back to the European languages. And once this knowledge started coming back, Europe raised to power once again, the Renaissance period by the 1500s. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that technological dominance is always associated with economic dominance, and any barriers to the propagation of knowledge works as a significant deterrent to this pursuit. Right? So those countries where information is more freely available and disseminated are not surprisingly the most advanced nations. Now, with this censorship in mind, let me show you who are the countries that have the highest censorship rates. So countries that most heavily censor the internet are countries like Myanmar, also known as Burma, Vietnam, Tunisia, Syria. Tunisia is an interesting case because there was the Arab Spring effect there as well, but unfortunately the youth, they got access to the knowledge, but then they didn't win to make an effective transformation in their society. So we have Iran, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, China, and North Korea. These are not known for being technologically advanced nations, right? They are actually quite backward when compared to the developed world. So this censorship of information that can be accessed online typically is characterized in three dimensions: censorship to impose traditional social values, censorship to keep political stability, and censorship to maintain national security, and then a combo of these three being the worst culprits, these ones. Now, who am I? Probably you already got an hint from my passionate description of the Portuguese discoveries. I'm from Portugal, this tiny little country next to Spain. I did most of my studies there up to my bachelor's degree. I spent 1 year as an exchange student in Milan, and then I've been in the US continuously taking my PhD, and now as an instructor since 2004. So learning my ways into the American culture. More. I visited more than 25 countries. Why am I telling you this? Well, I'm a strong believer that the more exposed you are to different cultures, the more competitive you are. The more knowledge you acquire, you learn how to tackle challenges from different perspectives. You learn a lot about relativism and how to live this life. And imposing one idea over everybody else, well, it hasn't been working. It ultimately leads to military conflicts and the like. I strongly recommend all of you to get out, to go visit. I'm not talking about taking pictures. I'm talking about doing an internship abroad. I'm talking about joining any kind of exchange program, studying abroad, of course, being one of them. The Peace Corps, another one. The point being, get out. Get out for an extended period, like a semester at least. Include yourself, experience the local cultures, because that will make you closer to be a true global citizen. And not surprisingly, that's the most the ones that have easier access to jobs. The recruiters are particularly interested in these kind of individuals because of the nature of business these days. You only make serious money if you are truly global, right? If you end up working for a company that only sells domestically, the salaries tend to be about 40% lower. The recent estimates is 40% lower than those of export competing industries. So you have increasingly more data showing you not only the positive consequences for society as a whole, that you acquire more knowledge and then disseminate it through your network, but also financial benefits that come at the personal level. So I strongly recommend you engaging in those programs. Now, if you are fed up of listening about globalization, well, I'm sorry to inform you that the world will continue to be increasingly more globalized. We live in an increasingly more interconnected world. This means a more rapid sharing of economic expansions, but also a more rapid sharing of hardship during economic slowdowns. For example, look at the 2008 financial meltdown. It propagated very rapidly this contagion effect to our European counterparts, right? Being the 2018 started in the United States with the housing market collapse and then the banks collapsing, and therefore anybody that was exposed to those banks were also collapsing. This is so-called domino effect, right? And then come those issues of being too big to fail, particularly due to these reasons, that when these immensely large companies fall, being in the banking sector, in the insurance sector, their default affects a huge number of people, and as we saw, even countries. So then the Europeans got into a crisis themselves, and the perpetuation of their crisis also impacted the recovery of the United States. Note that many authors refer to the last 10 years. We are in 2017, and the housing bubble bursted in July 2007. So many scientists refer to this period as the lost decade for the United States. What is it characterized by? Well, an increased socioeconomic turmoil that, as we have seen in many episodes in history, translate into the rise of extremism and populism. Let's go back in time and see something similar happen. This fall in the globalization process, okay, is associated with the interwar period. This is from 1914 to pretty much 1945, 46, and shows the fall of globalization, which the same is to say the rise in protectionism. Right? So the beginning of First World War concentrated in Europe geographically. Germany ended up losing this First World War as well. And the Allies, through the League of Nations, they meet in Versailles and sign a treaty where they impose high taxes to the German that basically prevented them from having a fast recovery from the destruction of war. The perpetuation of socioeconomic stress in Germany led to the rise of Hitler. Curiously, an Austrian-born became the German leader. Well, why did he win? Because he was the most extremist of them all. And he pointed the fingers to everybody else except themselves. So let's blame the Jews, for example, because of their wealth concentration. And it worked for the masses, particularly among the least informed. So there was the rise of this Aryan, pseudo-Aryan race, right? And it was a good seller, that slogan. So how does it end? Well, the Allies got together again and we smashed the Germans, right? So we have the US jumping into the Second World War right after Pearl Harbor is bombed, because prior to them there was no military intervention from the part of the United States. At the same time, we have Stalin, the Russians, also joining this coalition against Hitler. So the Russians from the east, Westerners from the west, they crushed the Reich, and that was the end of it, without, of course, avoiding millions and millions of deaths with these human experiment in pseudo-Aryan races. But that's an historical reason. That's why the propagation of this cheap populism is very dangerous. The ignoring science, ignoring knowledge for short slogans that please the uninformed masses is a quite dangerous path, as we just saw it pretty much 80 years ago. Nonetheless, despite these nuances, what we see from available data is the growing prevalence of globalization. Right? So the 1500s, the discovery period, and then the 1750s industrial revolution. We have here a blank, but when data becomes again available, we see that we are much higher than where we were before. and then it's disrupted by the interwar period. It's also worth mentioning at this time what was going on in the United States, right? So the United States, by 1929, the stock market bubble bursts, and the country ensues a period of socioeconomic stress of the likes of what was going on in Germany. We have a 25% unemployment rate. We didn't have the hyperinflation of Germany, but unemployment was severe. There were soup lines in the United States. So this dissatisfaction with the state of affairs gave rise to populism, which translated into the outcry for protectionism. And the tariffs on foreign-made goods were increased dramatically in the United States during this period, right? And not surprisingly, we got worse instead of getting better. At this time, as I was telling you, something similar was going on in Europe, and this outcry for national populism and therefore protectionism. As a consequence of all these countries imposing their protectionist policies, world trade declined by 2/3 at this time. So what happened was the consequences were more terrifying than the causes. And what we did after the stock market collapse was aggravated by the protectionist measures. Well, but it didn't last long, right? Because the informed people realized what was going on, and the path that was being taken was going to lead us to a much worse place. So in the following elections, party in power changes, and President Hoover is replaced by President Eisenhower, which comes with totally different policy of opening the borders. So the United States could have ended up in a place similar to what happened in Germany with the rise of fascism, but avoided a couple of years later, in the mid-30s, by opening the borders to trade, and that demarked the U.S. from the crazy stuff that was going on in Europe, and that only further emancipated the United States as the world leader. The globalization allowing it to become even stronger than it previously was. So another curious event that happens at the end of the World War II is this realization that we are better together than in isolationist policies, and many multinational institutions are created at this point. I'm talking about governmental institutions primarily, such as the United Nations, such as the World Bank, such as the International Monetary Fund, and as well as a treaty on the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which later on becomes the World Trade Organization in 1995. The GATT becomes the WTO. Why was this institution created? To have a platform for dialogue before engaging in military conflicts, basically to resolve our differences through dialogue rather than military actions. And as such, we have experienced a significant period of no world wars. Okay? You can see that globalization has been an emancipator of it. Trade, primarily, this aspect of globalization called trade of goods and services. And the reasoning being that, putting it in layman's terms, you don't kill your customers and your suppliers. Okay? What we typically observe around the world is the likelihood to engage in military conflict is much higher among countries with little trade relations, and much lower among countries with significant trade relations. Let me give you some examples. We are here in the United States, so let's talk about the United States. The Vietnam War. There were no significant trade relations with Vietnam prior to engaging in that war. The Korean War, same story, no significant trade. Both Iraq wars, the same story. Let me give you some contrasting examples. Why was France so upset at the United States about the Iraq war? Well, because France had strong trade relations with Iraq. They were buying their oil, for example. Why was Italy so upset at the United States about taking out of Gaddafi in Libya? Well, because Italy had strong trade relations with Libya, in particularly oil. So what I'm trying to reinforce is that trade and globalization, as a consequence of it, is a key emancipator of world peace. The more isolationist, the more protectionist, the more the countries live in the bubble, the higher the likelihood of military conflicts. Now, let me show you where are we at now in terms of GDP. How much does the US represent in the world when it comes to the size of its economy? So I'm looking at data from the USDA, the US Development Agency, and this is the data for 2016. So the world, another percent, right? We don't have intergalactic trade yet, so all that we have is what is produced in this planet. And the United States represents 22% of the world economy. There is no other country in the world with such relevance. Okay, look, Canada represents merely 2% of the world economy. Okay, let me show you, for example, the number 2 is China, not the Germany, for example, right, or Japan, but China, thanks to this huge size, right? We're talking about a country with a population of hovering the 1.4 billion, right? So there is a lot of people contributing to national GDP, even though the technological readiness is not yet as developed as the one in the United States. Right? Remember that in the United States, we have pretty much 325 million inhabitants contributing to GDP, whereas in China there's 1.4 billion. Right, so the scale of the economy playing a role as well, because we're not looking at GDP per capita. Now, look at Japan, which follows at number 3, 7% of the world economy. Let's look, for example, at Russia, because sometimes in the media it gives the impression that Russia is quite a powerful nation. Well, not economically. Let's find it here. Russia represents about 2%, a mere 2% of the world economy when it comes to its economic mighty. In Europe, the most relevant nation is Germany, representing about 5% by itself. Right? France, 4%, as big as UK with 4%. Right? Portugal is significant. We are just about 10 million and not really the most technologically advanced country in the world. Look at our neighbor Spain. They represent 2% of the world economy. They are also about 4 times bigger than us. Now, but the European Union as a whole represents more of the world economy than the United States. I remember the United States was at 22%, the European Union 26%. And this is something that, for example, President Trump was exposed to more recently when he was trying to negotiate a trade deal with Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. And he was unable, as Angela Merkel told him, because the European countries negotiate deals as a whole, not individually. That's something you're going to learn in the coming chapters, the different forms of trade agreements. And these different forms of agreements come with different levels of benefits and restrictions on what each country can do individually. It's like any other contract. Think about, for example, a marriage contract. Imposes rights and duties to anybody that signs a contract, right? So that's the same thing with trade agreements. Now, moving on to our next topic, what I'm going to show you is that contemporaneous with this increased globalization, there's an increased wealth throughout the world, and as such, the increase in standards of living, which are exemplified by such indicators as life expectancy.